I think that Christians should also believe in providence as well. God has guided this process. The very fact that we have some of these discrepancies or differences in our manuscripts is really a wonderful thing. It shows that there was no centralized control over the text. When I read some of these apocryphal books, some of these books that have been outside the Protestant canon, very simply, I don't hear the voice of the shepherd in them. Bigger point, I don't think any of these are so disruptive that, okay, we don't know who Jesus is now. You can take either one of these texts and establish Jesus as Messiah. Jesus came, he was the Messiah, he died for our sins, and it was prophesied in the Old Testament.
Hello, everyone. Thanks again for watching A Seat for Jesus. I am excited to have back for the second time Stephen Hackett. Welcome, Stephen.
Yeah, thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, we had a great chat last time talking about the book of Revelation, and this time had some other questions. Thought I'd have you back. We wanted to kind of talk about the differences between the old Masoretic texts and the Septuagint. Really, what are the differences? And then, maybe see where it goes from there. But I know I've seen a lot of content on your channel that kind of talked about this kind of stuff. So I thought you'd be a good person to ask. So that's why I had you on. All right, so let's just start with a basic question regarding this conversation between the Septuagint and the Masoretic text. What is the Masoretic text? Some people don't even quite understand what that is.
Yeah. So in simple terms, the Masoretic text is the standard Hebrew Bible that has come down to us today.
Mm-hmm.
Around 600 AD, somewhere around in there, certain Jewish scribes became concerned because Hebrew's dying out as a living language, and these scribes are concerned that people aren't going to be able to pronounce it, and so they began a very complicated system elegant system, I might say, of vowel pointings and a way that we could preserve the pronunciation of Hebrew. And these scribes, what was handed down to them, they copied meticulously. I mean, they were extremely careful about how they copied those manuscripts. I mean, down to counting letters. I mean, there's reports of procedures that they would go through once they encountered the divine name, and I mean, they were very, very, very careful about this. And for Orthodox Judaism today, conservative Orthodox Judaism, it's the standard Hebrew Bible, and it's usually the basis, the primary basis of most English translations today. So does that define that fairly well?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, definitely.
Okay. I should add that a lot of people kind of pit the Hebrew Bible against the Septuagint. And for them, it's an all or nothing thing, right? So I have some people that watch my channel who I thank you guys for watching my channel. Appreciate not trying to run anybody off, but who it's kind of an all or nothing thing where, like, I just don't trust the Masoretic text. And I get some comments which are very harsh sometimes towards the Jewish people, frankly, against what they think they may have, corrupted the text or something like that. I have never made that claim that there are intentional corruptions. I think one of the most significant differences between the Masoretic text and the Septuagint that have led people to think this is that in Psalm 22:16, where we're accustomed to the prophecy about Jesus, it says they have pierced my hands and my feet. That's a reading that is in some measure derived from the Septuagint, but in the Hebrew text, it has like a lion, my hands and my feet. And so some people think that the Jews deliberately altered their text to. Now, interestingly enough, the Dead Sea Scrolls, at least in some measure, this is kind of complicated, and there's things like defective spelling in Hebrew and all sorts of things we get into. But bottom line, essentially the Dead Sea Scrolls support the Septuagint reading, which is really, really fascinating.
Oh.
But again, there's some complexity here, but essentially it comes down to one pen stroke. The difference between a vav and a yod, whether the line came all the way down or not. And it's very easy to see how someone could make a mistake like that. So I don't think it was intentional. Another issue that I want to get with is this all or nothing thing. One of the things we're going to be discussing is the books that should be included and excluded.
Mm-hmm.
It's not as simple as to say, well, I'm just going to go with the Septuagint over the Hebrew Bible because the early church used the Septuagint. It's not that simple, because there's the Septuagint. Even defining the Septuagint is a little bit of a difficult thing, which we've already touched on. But these books came to be collected together and bound together at a much later time. These were not translated at the same time.
Right.
Josephus actually has a very high opinion. Josephus, early Jewish historian, living roughly around the time of the apostles, a little later. He was eyewitness to the destruction of Jerusalem. So yeah, he was contemporaneous with some of the apostles. He has a high opinion of the Septuagint. He really does. You read what he says, and he spends a lot of time discussing about how the Lord used the Septuagint. And ironically, Josephus is a Jewish priest, right at the heart of Judaism, a Pharisee, and there's many times where he aligns more closely with the Septuagint than the later Masoretic Text. So that's, to me, that's significant.
Interesting.
But he has this very high value on the Septuagint. But by Septuagint, he's only talking about, and he doesn't use the word Septuagint, he calls it the translation of the 70, because the legend was that scholars, 70 or 72, 6 from each tribe, went down to Alexandria, Egypt, and then translated the Septuagint. And he waxes almost poetic about how, wonderful job they did, but it was the first 5 books of Moses. So then when he gets to discussing about which books that he thinks, and this might be a good transition into our topic about which books should be included or not.
Yep.
When he talks about which books are authoritative for them or which books are trusted, he gives 22 books. Okay, so Protestants, we have 39 books. Well, did Josephus have less? Well, no, what's happened here is, like, for example, the minor prophets, you can get those on one scroll, right? So those would count as one book. You're going to combine First Chronicles and Second Chronicles. You can do all the math, but it will come out to something close to the Protestant canon. I know some people will dispute this. That's fine, but I think there's been some good scholarship to establish this, that it's something pretty close to the Protestant canon. He is not thinking that Maccabees, First and Second Maccabees, are to be included, because he also gives us a time frame. He believes that these have been written from the time of Moses to the time of Artaxerxes. So that would throw books of Enoch out of the picture. So that's just kind of a synopsis. I know you asked me about the Masoretic Text, but I wanted to touch a little bit about why some people will have sort of an all or nothing approach to these two things.
No, that's great context. I've actually never heard of that, so that's really helpful to know. So, what are some of the differences between the Septuagint and the Masoretic Text?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think it all depends on what someone means by the word Septuagint. And the word Septuagint is a very flexible term, and it's used in a number of different ways by different people. So typically when I use the word Septuagint, I just mean the oldest available Greek translations that we have of the Hebrew Bible. And so this is sort of part of a translation process. So around 250 BC, something like that, the Hebrew Bible began to be translated into Greek. And that process took some time, and there were certain books that were translated before other books, and it appears like there were different translators of some of these very different books. And so, yeah, there's a number of interesting differences between what we have in those early Greek translations than what we have today in the Hebrew Bible. And so, one interesting fact about this is that before we had the Dead Sea Scrolls, our oldest complete or nearly complete Hebrew Bible dated to about 900 AD, 1000 AD, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And we have copies of the Septuagint, which are much older than that, which are centuries older than that. And with the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, we found out that some of the readings that people just dismissed out of hand out of the Septuagint actually found support in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So I'll just give one example to start, and then we can kind of go back and forth a little bit. But just one example, one of my favorite ones, is that in the Septuagint, Goliath is considerably shorter than in the Masoretic Text. So I learned Goliath being about 9 feet tall, something like that. And in the Septuagint, he's 4 cubits in a span, which would come out probably, depending on what kind of cubit you use, would probably come out to about 6'9". So that's quite a bit shorter.
Yeah, really.
So maybe the Septuagint just got it wrong. But if it did, Josephus also got it wrong. And it would also be wrong in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Once the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, people began to take this reading very seriously. And there's arguments back and forth which way you want to go. But that's one. I mean, it's not the biggest difference between these, but it's the kinds of differences that you see. And because the Septuagint represents, in many cases, a very ancient form of the text, sometimes it becomes significant when we're thinking about establishing the original text of the Old Testament.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting. Like, so if Goliath really wasn't super tall, do you think it changes anything? Does it change anything for you as far as the story with David? And
but it is part of something that's going on that's larger in the Septuagint, in the story of David and Goliath. I don't know how recently you've read the story. And my wife and I have actually been watching the Amazon series of David and Goliath, or the David story. It's kind of a neat, but I mean obviously the Amazon version of this is not very historically accurate. Of course, they have this, but you can kind of see this tendency right now in those movies. If you watch those movies, the giants are massive. I mean, they're bigger than what's in the Masoretic text.
Yeah.
So there's kind of this tendency to get Goliath bigger and bigger. That's assuming if the Septuagint's got it right, and I'm not claiming that at this point,
right.
But it wouldn't change anything. But it's part of this larger thing that goes on in the Septuagint. And the reason I brought up those movies is because the movies actually try to smooth this out a little bit. So in the story of David and Goliath, or really before David and Goliath, David's already been working with Saul. I mean, he's been going in and he's been playing the harp and all of these things. And so presumably he's part of the court. I mean, Saul would know who this guy is.
Oh, yeah.
And he's even tried on his armor, right? Before he goes out to fight Goliath. He goes and tries on Saul's armor. And then David goes out and kills Goliath. And I know the verse from the King James Version. It's something like this, that after David kills Goliath, I think it is Saul that turns to Abner and says, Abner, who is this stripling, right? Who is this young man? And it's very odd when you read it. It's kind of jarring. It's like, how do you not know who David is? He's been in your court. And you have a number of things that kind of go on like that in the way it is in the Masoretic text. In the Septuagint, all of those kind of tensions and problems disappear. Now, there's two arguments to be had there. You could say, well, the Septuagint translators wanted to smooth those difficulties out, or you could say maybe the Masoretic text, jumbled this a little bit. Again, I'm not making a claim here one way or the other. It's just when we talk about the kinds of differences between the Septuagint and the Masoretic text, that's the kind of differences that we're dealing with. Like, there's some maybe in some ways more important differences. Like Jeremiah is different lengths depending on whether you go into the Hebrew text or the Septuagint.
Mm-hmm.
And there are a number of minor differences. Like, for example, in Stephen's speech in Acts, that's a sermon that he gives right before he's about to be stoned. And he says that 75 souls went down into Egypt. Well, when you turn to the Masoretic text, the Hebrew text, it says 70 souls went down into Egypt. Well, the Septuagint has 75 souls, and so does the Dead Sea Scrolls. So there's a lot of little minor differences like that as well. That's all part of, working through these different textual traditions. Now, to your bigger point, I don't think any of these are so disruptive that, okay, we don't know who Jesus is now, or, not that the Old Testament, not that Jesus is, the historical Jesus is placed in the Old Testament, but I'm talking about messianic prophecies that
Right.
foretell his coming. It's not like if you have the Hebrew Bible and you're not going to be able to see those, or vice versa with the Septuagint. But there's a lot of minor discrepancies between the two.
Well, people are so easy to jump on the most minor discrepancy, talking about inspiration and all that. What are your thoughts on that? I mean, it's probably just a translation thing, but people will say, well, if it's inspired by God, why is there a difference in the first place?
Yeah, no, to me, I have to be careful because this has never been an issue that's bothered me. Little differences between manuscripts, because I don't know how many, now there's a whole generation of people who hardly know anything different than copy and paste, right?
Yeah,
So you can pretty
exactly.
well get, but
Right.
I remember being in school and copying things out, and I would be the worst scribe in the world. I
Mhm.
omit words when I'm trying to copy by hand. Those
Oh,
sorts
yeah.
of things happen. The wonderful thing is that the very fact that we have some of these discrepancies or differences in our manuscripts is really a wonderful thing in this respect. It shows that there was no centralized control over the text. So if we only had one edition of the Hebrew scriptures, I'm sure there would be people that would stand firm and say there's no variation here, no, we've got it exactly. But the charge would be, the skeptics then would charge that, oh, you guys cooked the books, right? You just
Yeah.
made it say this, and there's been centralized control. And so, but the very fact that we have the Septuagint, we have the Peshitta, we have all these different versions coming out with no centralized control. And some of the worst differences we come up with was Goliath 6'9" or 9'9", right? Um, you know, those are the
Right.
kinds of, those are mainly the kinds, and to me they're very fascinating, very interesting to look into, but they don't affect the gospel. They don't
Yeah.
destroy the gospel. Now, there are some really fascinating ones that have impacts on messianic prophecies that I think are fun to delve into. But I have beside me here, this is a Biblia Graeca here, actually, if I can get it into the camera here. And this is actually
Oh.
combined Septuagint and uh, uh, Greek New Testament.
Hmm.
And I also have the Biblia Sacra here, and this is a combined Greek New Testament with the Hebrew. You can take either one of these texts and establish Jesus as Messiah. There may be some minor differences, even in some messianic prophecies, and I think those are fascinating. But either way, Jesus came, he was the Messiah, he died for our sins, and it was prophesied in the Old Testament.
Yeah. The Book of Enoch kind of shows a Messiah figure.
Yeah.
Do you know much about that? Is it? I'm pretty sure he's talking about the future Jesus, the Messiah. There's just one spot where he kind of talks about himself. It seems as the Son of Man or Son of God. I'm not sure if you know any details about that.
Well, for me, for my part, I think the Book of Enoch is interesting. I think it's worth reading,
Hmm.
um, but I don't put the same kind of weight on it as I would any of the other uh,
Hmm.
writings that have come down to us. That I don't consider it scripture. I consider it to be something that would be interesting and value. And I think it was in some circles of Judaism during the Second Temple, during Second Temple Judaism, it was something of a bestseller, right? I mean, people were
Yeah.
reading it, and you can see evidence of this, I think, in Second Peter and in Jude, that they were drawing from portions of this. But I think it's significant. I was just recently read through actually the Lexham's edition of the Book of Enoch, and it's based on a 6th century Greek manuscript of the Book of Enoch. And the documentation that we have for Enoch, so there's questions that I personally have about the Book of Enoch, is how much of what we have in the Book of Enoch would have been, and this is a text critical question, the way that the Book of Enoch is right now, how close was that to what was available for Jude and Second Peter? We can see that there's similarities between there, but even if you look at what we have available to us now, we can't establish it, I think, with the same rigorous in the same rigorous way that we can establish books of the New Testament. So bottom line, I think the Book of Enoch is interesting when it talks about a Messiah figure. All those things I think are worth weighing, considering, but I think of them more as background material to what was in the cultural mindset of Jews living in the Second Temple period.
Yeah, definitely fills in some gaps in some areas, and I've read some of it, and I have a book that I'm kind of going through. Haven't finished it yet, but it kind of goes with this next question. Speaking of books like Enoch, and then speaking about inspiration, there was once one of the oldest Bibles has a bunch of these other books in it, like 80 books total, and then at some point, guys got together and removed some. Can you explain that process? Why did they do that? And then what does it say about these other books? Are they useful or not? Why did they get rid of them? Things like that.
Yeah, no, I think that's worth. I think you have to look at the books kind of individually. So it's not like each book has the same amount of value,
Right.
that they're the same thing.
Right.
So from my perspective, I'm very much indebted to the Protestant Reformation, and so that influences surely a lot of how I think about the subject. But I think it's an oversimplification for Protestants will tend to oversimplify this, and let's say Roman Catholics, when we're talking about deuterocanonical books for them, they'll oversimplify it also. So one oversimplification is the Catholics added a bunch of books, right?
Okay.
Another oversimplification is the Protestants just took a bunch of books out. Right? So that's one thing. One of the things the early Christians were concerned about establishing which books should be considered part of the canon. If I go too lengthy here, just let me know.
Oh, no.
But the early Christians were interested in trying to establish what was part of the canon. And one of the things that happened that was sort of revolutionary was the invention of the codex, right? So the codex is like this. This is a book, an actual codex. Before that, the scroll was the thing to have. But a scroll is very limited because you can only get so many writings on it. So, there's a question about now we're able to bind certain books together. Now, our oldest manuscripts that we have that are in codex form still, among them are some of our big majuscule manuscripts, which are like Codex Alexandrinus, Codex Sinaiticus, Codex Vaticanus, those manuscripts. What's interesting about that is someone might say, well, all we need to do is just go back to, so that those would be like 4th century codices. All we need to do is just go back to those manuscripts and go look and see what were in those manuscripts, and then we would just know. All right, that's what they considered to be scripture at that time.
Mm.
The problem with that is nobody accepts some of the books that are in those. For example, Codex Sinaiticus has Fourth Maccabees. It has the Epistle of Barnabas. It has the Shepherd of Hermas. And then these codices don't contain the same books.
Right.
So what's interesting, I think, is to think of this. Now, we think of it in modern terms because we get a neatly bound book, and it's got these various these various books in it,
Yeah.
and they're all the same, right? They all come out. But now, if you are someone wealthy enough to get someone to prepare a manuscript for you, or a book like that, we're talking, I don't know, that might cost. Someone told me compared it to almost like buying a house today. If you were to get someone to actually take the time to actually handwrite those out,
Mm-hmm.
so you could actually potentially want a copy of the Shepherd of Hermas, because that's like functioning for you like a library. So okay, so I think we can establish that one thing that we can't do is just go back and look at these ancient manuscripts, because they don't, like I said, they don't agree with each other. They have different books inside of them.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So another thing that we could possibly do is go back to the church fathers. What did the church fathers say? What did they think were early writings? And then here's the complexity. Again, let's go back to the 4th century. You have Jerome on one side, and you have Augustine on the other side. Jerome is saying we need to follow the Hebrew canon. We need to go with what the Hebrews went with for the Old Testament. Nothing more, nothing less, as far as our Old Testament. Now, some of these other books, they're good for reading. They're useful for instruction. But then you had Augustine on the other hand and say, no, we need to keep these as part of our canon. And so this really doesn't really come to a head until the Reformation. And again, at the time of the Reformation, the Protestants went with Jerome's side, and the Roman Catholics went with the Augustinian side of this. And there was still debate. So you could find good Roman Catholics in the time of Luther arguing for the Protestant canon. Yeah, and I think we can go back and we can look that this debate is very old. It's not simple, but for me, it comes down to when I read some of these apocryphal books, some of these books that have been outside the Protestant canon, very simply, I don't hear the voice of the shepherd in them. Yeah. I find discrepancies like almsgiving being able to atone for sins. I find historical problems where I think it's the book of Judith that says that Nebuchadnezzar was the king of Assyria when he was actually the king of Babylon. It just doesn't seem to resonate with my heart, with my soul, like the Old Testament, where I can read that and I feel like I hear the voice of the shepherd. It's two different things for me. And so the historical debate is very complex. And I think people can make arguments on both sides of the debate. But I think for me, honestly, the best cure for me believing some of these books were inspired is just to read them.
Yeah, right.
And find out that they're not. Like, even that's the case for me for Enoch. You read Enoch, and it's just like, not that was in the discussion with Jerome and Augustine. Enoch was considered outside of most Christians would not have considered that canonical. Augustine and Jerome weren't debating about books like that. Thomas, they weren't debating about those. They considered those books to be, if anything, harmful and dangerous. They didn't consider those to be part of canon. Or even part of these books. So they had another class of books that were to be read. But yeah, so that's, I probably spent too much time on that, but that's where I'm at on it.
No, that's very, very good, and a lot of good information. One thing I had heard, I don't know if you had ever heard this, a little controversial as well. about the book of Revelation. I had heard someone, I think it might have been Martin Luther himself, who may not have wanted it in the canon. Hear anything about that?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, Martin Luther had some reservations about Hebrews. He had some reservations about James. He had some reservation about the Book of Revelation.
Hmm.
And I think what this underscores for us is, again, we have the luxury of inheriting our Bibles. So whether you're Orthodox, whether you're Roman Catholic, whether you're Protestant, someone puts a Bible in your hand, or you go to the bookstore and it's already figured out for you which books are in and which books are
Yeah,
out.
right.
But you have to think about, prior to the printing press, really, and this ability to mass produce books, there are. I would encourage people to read Eusebius too. Eusebius, church historian. There are books that are very close to the center of what's galvanizing both Christians and Jews. For example, pretty much anybody who's an actual Christian, not a heretic, has no problem with the four Gospels. Four Gospels, they're in, no problem. Acts, no
Right.
problem. The Pauline epistles, those pretty much no problem, except for the ones like maybe Hebrews, where some people doubted whether Paul actually wrote it or not. That found some issue. What Martin Luther was doing is he was the books that he had a little bit of problems with were some books that historically some Christians had questioned in certain communities. So he famously called the book of James an epistle of straw. But the funny thing about that is, I think it's in Philip Schaff, History of the Christian Church. He says that when Luther did find some weapons against the Roman Catholic Church in the book of Revelation, he sort of warmed up to the book.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Is there any book that you think could be close, or like in your just opinion, you're like, this could be in, it could not be in, like something that's like close for you personally to have been in the canon?
Not I wouldn't say for me personally. Um, I would say that if you study the historical record, I think there was and I think here's something else I really should add. I really need to add this.
Mhm.
I think that Christians should also believe in providence as well, like
Right.
that God has guided this process. Now, again, Roman Catholics and Protestants are going to disagree about 7 books. For the most part, we pretty much agree about the Bible, not how its theology, but the boundaries of it outside of about 7 books or so. But I think for me personally, I feel very confident with the books that we do have.
Mhm.
I would say that it is interesting as far as Old Testament books that were probably a little closer to not making it into the canon that people had reservations about. Surprisingly, Esther was one of the books that sometimes didn't make the canon list. And I think part of that is because the book of Esther doesn't mention, at least in the Hebrew Bible, this is one of the differences between the Hebrew Bible and the Septuagint again. At least in the
Okay.
Hebrew Bible, the word God doesn't appear in the book of Esther.
Yeah.
So I think we would be diminished if we didn't have the book of Esther.
Mhm.
But if we didn't, I mean, we would still have all the essentials of what we need and things like that. But that was one of the Old Testament books that were probably pretty close to the edge.
Awesome. Well, all this has been really interesting to dive a little deeper into. You're a wealth of knowledge with all of this kind of stuff. I know I see all those books back there. You've probably read them all, right?
Well, I like what somebody said when they asked him that. He said, "Well, some of them twice."
Right.
Which wasn't a lie. He just hadn't read them all yet, but he'd read some of them twice.
Some of them, yeah. So, yeah, this is great for anyone who wants to dive deeper into this subject and other deep theological questions. Stephen's channel is Biblical Studies and Reviews. I'll put it here at the bottom, and go check him out. And Stephen, thanks again for joining, and really appreciate you coming and chatting.
Thank you so much. Really been a pleasure.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Have a good night.
You too.